Hello everyone who's tuning in with me tonight. Tonight I am going to be discussing the JFK administration, his life, his assassination, and some conspiracy theories behind him. The reason for this is it's just going to be informational. Any questions or comments or concerns that you have, please. I have a moderator. My moderator is going to be, his name will be on the bottom, you'll see him, his name is Frank Nordstrom. He will be the one kind of facilitating today's ideals, discussions, and questions, and he'll be the one to help me answer and to help me guide you along the way. So, as we start off, what really do we know about JFK? John Fitzgerald Kennedy, our 35th President of the United States, was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, on May 29th, 1917. He was of Irish descent, big Irish Catholic family, and actually our first president who was Catholic, and our only one to this day. He actually graduated Harvard University in 1940. He went into the Navy, and after he went into the Navy, in 1943, he was commanding a PT boat as a lieutenant, and after he commanded this PT boat, it was sunk by a Japanese destroyer. Despite having grave injuries, he led the survivors through very, very perilous waters to safety. I see Bernie Kionis is watching. I have to say, Bernie, glad you're watching. I know you love JFK as much as I do. When he was in the Navy, actually, starting out as an ensign and going up to a lieutenant, he had a lot of problems, believe it or not. He was promoted very fast, however, due to his father's connections. The Kennedy family was a very famous, very rich, very big family. JFK himself was older. So, with this, after he came back from the war, he won the Democratic nomination to be a congressman from the Boston area. In 1953, from being his representative and congressman, he moved to the Senate. He married Miss Jacqueline Bouvier on September 12th, 1953, and in 1955, while recuperating from a back operation, he wrote Profiles in Courage, which actually won a Pulitzer Prize. Profiles in Courage is a wonderful book if you ever get the chance to read it. It's written straight from JFK, and I mean, it's really, really good. Sorry, I'm moving my notes. I have a new camera, new position tonight. So my notes are over here now on my computer screen while the camera's here. Just better set up now. So in 1956, Kennedy became very popular among the Democratic Party, and he almost won the nomination to be the vice president. And 4 years later, he was a first ballot nominee for president itself, for Democratic Party. Now, millions watched his televised debates with Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon and JFK had the first ever televised presidential debates. People said that was a turning point in the election for him. Kennedy was very young, very youthful, good-looking. Nixon kind of didn't look that well. The way they did his makeup, he looked old, looked dark, looked scary, and people just didn't like that. You're drawn to youthful face. We all know this. We all know the story of when the president gets elected, he looks really young. When he exits office 8 years later, he doesn't look that good. So, before I continue on now, because I'm just going to go over a brief overview before I get into more details, chat is encouraged with this. Please comment, ask questions, anything. My moderator will be able to facilitate anything if you have any questions. So, I'm going to pull up my notes for you. We're going to start off, actually, with his inauguration. The reason I start with his inauguration rather than from the beginning of his birth and growing up is most people know him from that standpoint rather than the other. So, sorry, pulling it up here. Alright, so, in his inaugural address, Kennedy, his famous statement is, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." As president, he had set out to redeem his campaign pledge to get America moving. There's an old thing by Salinger who wrote many articles about him was a friend, that America was a train and had dead stopped, and Kennedy kept it going, pushed America forward. So we want to use that and that knowledge as we go through this talk. His economic programs launched the country to its longest sustained expansion since World War II. Before his death, he had laid plans for a massive assault persisting on pockets of privatization and poverty. We all know President Johnson's famous war on poverty. Well, he didn't start it. It started with Kennedy, which usually we do see with a lot of presidents. Something starts before them, something happens, and then the next president takes it up. Well, Kennedy was the one who started this war on poverty. He was young and youthful. That's what drew a lot of people to him at his inauguration. He promised the people a youthful president and an open president. And that's what he gave them. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Wow, I thought this one would stay up. Sorry, the new camera, it was supposed to stay. I guess it's not going to. Gotta love technology. There we go. So, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a CIA plan to go in and overthrow Fidel Castro. So, they decided to use expats, expatriates of Cuba, as well as CIA agents, and it failed horribly. We lost a lot of people. They found out very easily that, hey, America's behind this, and instead of trying vehemently deny this, and vehemently deny any and all involvement of the United States, he decided, I'm going to take full responsibility, and I'm going to take responsibility myself. It was someone else's idea, but I'm the president, I signed off on this, it's my fault. Which had never been seen before. It's just a crazy, crazy situation. So, how did this happen with the Bay of Pigs? Shortly after he was inaugurated, Kennedy had allowed a ban on Cuban exiles already armed and trained to invade their homeland. He said, no. We're going to let them go. We're going to permit that, and we're going to ban everyone else from going. Start an embargo. So, soon after that, the Soviet Union renewed its campaign against the West, and especially West Berlin. Kennedy replied to this as they started building up forces to, he increased the nation's military strength, including efforts in outer space. It's very important to know and note that he's the one who said within 10 years, we should see a man on the moon, see him safely to the moon, and see him safely back to Earth. So, even though the first man did not land until Nixon's presidency years later, once again, it was set in motion by Kennedy. Excuse me. So, he reinforced not only our own military, but the Berlin garrison, and he confronted by this reaction, Moscow, after they erected the Berlin Wall, it relaxed its pressure on Central Europe, but kept it on East Europe. They wanted East Berlin and East Germany and all the East, and the more Balkans and countries in the East, they kind of said, we'll deal with those later. So, they decided to, the Russians, or the USSR at the time, decided to send some missiles to Cuba. Cuba is only 90 miles from Key West, Florida. Very strategic position to launch any nuclear strikes. These nuclear missiles is what we know now as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was discovered by a spy plane, a U-2, after reconnaissance in October of 1962. We're coming up actually on that anniversary. He imposed the quarantine on all offensive weapons bound for Cuba. This quarantine was just lifted by President Obama. So you can see how long this has persisted. This is 1962. It's 2016. 50 years later. It's insane. So while the world was kind of trembling, because they were worried about the brink of nuclear war and just USSR and Russia and America, we could just blow everybody up 10 times over with the amount of nuclear weapons we had. It was insane. The Americans responded to Cuban crisis evidently persuaded Moscow what we call nuclear blackmail, meaning that yes, we pulled out our missiles or they pulled out their missiles, but as well, we pulled out our missiles. We had missiles in Turkey aimed at Moscow. So even though this was a behind the scenes and backdoor deal that we see that was actually not negotiated by our ambassadors. It was negotiated by John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, who was Secretary of State. Or no, sorry, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General. Wow. Sorry. And it's something that's seen that they trusted their family and themselves more than anyone else. It's an insane concept. I know I'm using that word a lot. But we think of our family as close-knit. He obviously did. He made his brother Attorney General. Attorney General is the leader of the Department of Justice. It's really, really crazy. So, like I said, this is an overview part for those who are just joining us. We'll be going on to more detail here, starting with Kennedy's election here in a moment. So, Kennedy contended that both sides had vital interests in stopping the spread of nuclear weapons and slowing this arms race. The contention which led to a test ban treaty actually in 1963. The months after the Cuban Missile Crisis showed that there was a lot of progress toward this goal of, as it was quoted, a world of law and free choice, banishing the world of war and coercion. His administration saw the beginning of hope for both equal rights of Americans and peace throughout the world. Which, I mean, that's something we're still striving for today, and it's set in motion with JFK. So, as we move on from this, we're going to go kind of into the in-depth part. Kennedy was killed on 11/23/63 and Dallas, Texas. 22nd, not 23rd. November 22nd, 1963. He was barely past his first 1,000 days in office. So barely 1,000 days in office when he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, becoming the youngest president to die. Naturally, as he was the youngest president elected. So it was very interesting. We'll get into those conspiracy theories later. So to start off with JFK himself. Pulling up my notes for that. John was an interesting man. He grew up in a very well-to-do house. He was born at 83 Bell Street in Brookline, Massachusetts on May 29, 1917. He was born to his father, Joseph Patrick, or Joe Kennedy, and his mother, Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, his father was a businessman and a politician, and his mother is known as a philanthropist and socialite. His grandfathers, P.J. Kennedy and the Boston mayor, John F. Kennedy, were both Massachusetts politicians, and all four of his grandparents were children of Irish immigrants. Now, Kennedy had one elder brother, Joseph Jr., and 7 younger siblings, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Ted, or Edward. Joseph Jr. was actually killed in action during World War II himself. So Robert was JFK's Attorney General and then a senator who was actually assassinated himself in 1968 when running for president in Los Angeles, California. And Edward, Ted, was a long-term serving U.S. senator from 1962 until he died of cancer, brain cancer, in 2009. Yes, I have to mention the sweet Kennedy poster behind me since I'm at a break point. That Kennedy poster is actually an original Kennedy poster for the election, leadership in the 1960s. That was a great buy. Those who know me, I collect newspapers and collect many historical artifacts. Excuse me. And that was one of them that I found for a very good price not that long ago, actually. So, he was kind of a normal, well-to-do student. They moved, when he was about 10, they moved to a big 20-room Georgian-styled mansion, which it was insane in the Bronx. And when he was in New York, he attended the lower campus of the Riverdale Country School, which was a private school for boys for his middle school years, 5th to 7th grade. Then the family moved to a suburb of Bronxville, New York, where he became a member of Boy Scout Troop Number 2. After he was there, he spent summers at his home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and Christmas evening and winter holidays and Easter holidays at their winter home in Palm Beach, Florida. This family, like I said, had homes in Brookline, Boston, Riverdale, Bronx, Bronxville, and Palm Beach, Florida. Once again, Hyannisport as well. That it was not a normal middle-class family. This, what we would call a silver spoon. He came up rich. Which is sad to say and hard to say because he was actually a really good person, had a good heart. And we'll get to his other remarks later. So in 1936, he enrolled in Harvard College, where he produced that year's annual Freshman Smoker, called by a reviewer an elaborate entertainment, which included its cast outstanding performance and personalities of the radio, screen, and sports world. So he tried out for the football, golf, and swimming teams and earned a spot on the varsity swimming team. So this man was a swimmer. Explains his body, right, for all the girls out there. Kennedy also sailed in the Star class, and he won the 1936 Nantucket Sound Star Championship. In 1937, he sailed to France, taking his convertible with him, actually, and spent 10 weeks driving through Europe with Billings. In 1938, Kennedy sailed overseas with his father and his brother to work at the American Embassy in London, where his father was President Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador to the Court of St. James. And the Court of St. James is what we would call today just the English court, the Queen and Prime Minister and so forth. It's just something they do. Old school names. If we were as old as England, we'd have something really cool besides the U.S. ambassador. So, as an upperclassman at Harvard, Kennedy himself became a more serious student and actually developed an interest in political philosophy. Go figure. Family's a bunch of politicians. In his junior year, he actually made the dean's list. And in 1940, Kennedy completed his thesis, Appeasement in Munich, about the British participation in that Munich Agreement, and he kind of criticized Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England at the time of this appeasement, for a while. Later on, he would be published under the bestseller of what we'd call Why England Slept, is the name of the book. So when he graduated from Harvard College, cum laude, with a Bachelor's of Arts in Government, concentrating on international affairs. And that year, later on, Kennedy enrolled in and audited classes at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. In early 1941, he left and helped his father write a memoir of his 3 years as an American ambassador, and then he traveled throughout South America. And the three main countries that he traveled to in South America were Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Now, on September 12, 1953, after a one-year courtship, Kennedy was 36 years old and married the 24-year-old Jacqueline Bouvier at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. So that's kind of where he started. Now, just a little side note about Jackie O here. Jacqueline Kennedy, the reason she's Jackie O is that Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy, after her husband died, she remarried. Jackie O was one of the strongest first ladies we've ever had. It was very well known that JFK was, he started out, how do I say this? He was a player. Had many different affairs throughout his time. A lot of different problems with women. He played around just a little. Just a little. So this is my first question section that I'm going to start answering before I go into World War II and his Navy. For Kate, how does his political career start? We're actually going to get that. So, I actually knew someone would ask this. How did JFK meet Jacqueline? So, according to my research with him, when he met Jackie, oh gosh, I gotta find it. Okay, yes, here I am. His name was John, but his family called him Jack. A lot of people actually, to answer Kate's question, other people I call him Jack, just a thing. But anyway, so Jacqueline Bouvier started her first job in 1951 as an inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald. It was a newspaper. She went around the city, took pictures of people she encountered, asked them questions on issues of the day, wove their answers into her newspaper column. Among those she interviewed for the column was Richard Nixon. She also covered the first inauguration of Eisenhower and the coronation of Elizabeth II. So during this time, she met John F. Kennedy, and he was a congressman and soon to be elected senator from Massachusetts. He courted her and didn't really do a lot to court her. Took her out on a few public things and said, all right, we're going to do this. Nothing else really matters to me. I'm going to marry you. Like I said, less than a courtship. Less than 1 year of a courtship, which usually doesn't happen. I'm pulling up all my questions, guys. Mr. Nordstrom, we'll get to that. But yeah, he met Jacqueline because she was a photographer looking for famous people, and he was a congressman. She was writing columns about him in the politics that she said they kind of fell in love, and it kind of went that way. All right. So, after he married, or technically actually before he married Jacqueline Kennedy, he served in our armed forces in World War II. Excuse me. I've had a long day at work, need to drink something. So, Kennedy attempted to enter the Army's Officers Candidate School in 1940, but he was medically disqualified due to his chronic lower back problems. However, on September 24th, 1941, after he exercised for months to strengthen his back, and with the help of his father's old friend, who was the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and a former naval attaché to Joseph Kennedy himself, he joined the U.S. Naval Reserves. And he was commissioned as an ensign on October 26, 1941, and joined the staff of the Office of the Naval Intelligence in D.C. In 1942, Kennedy was assigned to the field office of the Naval 6th District in Charleston, South Carolina, and he attended the Officers Training School at Northwest University in Chicago, Illinois from July 27th to September 27th of that year. And he voluntarily entered Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. On October 10th, he was promoted to Lieutenant Junior grade, and he completed his training on December 2nd and was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 4. His first command was PT-101, patrol boat, from December 7th, 1942, 1 year after the bombing at Pearl Harbor, until February 23rd, 1943. It was a PT boat used for training while Kennedy was an instructor at Melville. He then led 3 Hutchins PT boats, PT-98, PT-99, and again PT-101, which were being relocated from Met Braun 4 in Melville back to Jackson, Florida to Met Braun 1. During the trip south, he was hospitalized briefly, actually, in Jacksonville after diving into the cold water to a propeller. So, thereafter, Kennedy was assigned duty in Panama and later the Pacific Theater, where he eventually commanded the patrol torpedo boats, PT-109 and PT-59. So, in April 43, he was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron, MOTAC 2, and he took command of PT-109 on April 24th of that year. And he was in the Solomons. On the night of August 1st to 2nd, on his 31st mission, it was nighttime patrols near New Georgia, in the Solomon Islands, one of the nice little islands. And Kennedy spotted a Japanese destroyer and attempted to turn to attack. PT-109 was rammed suddenly at an angle and cut in half by the destroyer, the Japanese destroyer, costing 2 PT-109 crew members' lives. He lost 2 sailors in that. So Kennedy, he gathered his surviving 10 crew members, including those who were injured, around the wreckage to vote on whether they were going to fight or surrender. A very famous quote came from this, and they all agreed on it. "There's nothing in the book about a situation like this. A lot of you men have families, and some of you have children. What do you want to do? I have nothing to lose." So, sunning surrender, the men swam towards a small island 3 miles away. Remember, some of them were injured, and they all just got hurt and had to abandon the ship. They swam 3 miles. Despite he re-injuring his back again in that collision, he towed a very badly burned crewman through the water to the island with a life jacket strapped. My back? Okay, sorry. Internet went down for a second. My live feed died. Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah, he had the life jacket strapped between his teeth as he swam and pulled somebody. You ever tried to pull somebody's full body weight between your teeth? It's not very easy. But this man did it. On August, they went, that's right, then they later went to a second island to escape some more Japanese detection, and where his crew was subsequently rescued August 8th. So they're there from the 2nd to the 8th. Alright, thank you, Mr. Nordstrom. Yeah, not 3 seconds is okay. Kennedy and Ensign Leonard Tom, his executive officer on PT-109, were both awarded the Navy Marine Corps Medal for Heroism and the Purple Heart. On September 1st, 1943, Kennedy returned to duty and took command of a PT boat converted into a gunboat, PT-59. In October, Kennedy was promoted to a lieutenant. Now, before I go any further, since no one has any questions, I'll take this opportunity to show something else that I have. Once again, I collect many things. Something I got and had verified and notarized is something that belonged to JFK himself. These are his lieutenant's bars and his ensign bars. So, if anyone wants to see these and look them up, there's a picture on my Facebook page a while ago, but these are his actual bars that you'd wear on your shoulders. I can take them out, but I put them in a nice case because I want to keep them set. I don't have any of his medals. I wish I did. That would be really awesome. So, on November 2nd, PT-59, which included 3 former PT-109 crew members themselves who survived with Kennedy, took part in another boat in a successful rescue of 87 Marines stranded on 2 rescue landing crafts. It was an island held by the Japanese, and they ended up getting him, which is awesome. So Kennedy was relieved of his command on PT-59 on November 18th under doctor's orders, and he was ordered to return back to the United States. So his wartime service was over. After receiving a treatment for his injury, he was released from active duty in late 1944. So beginning in January 45, Kennedy spent 3 months recovering from his back injury at Castle Hot Springs, which was a resort and a temporary military hospital in Arizona. Very nice place. Kennedy was in Chelsea Naval Hospital from May to December of that year in 44, and on June 12th he was presented the Navy Marine Corps Medal, the Navy's highest non-combatant decoration for heroism, for his heroic actions on the 1st through 2nd in 43, and his Purple Heart for his injury on 109, on August 1st. After the war, Kennedy felt that the medal he'd received for heroism was not a combat award and asked that he be reconsidered for the Silver Star, which had originally been recommended for him. In 1950, the Department of the Navy finally offered Kennedy a Bronze Star to recognize his military service. However, he would have to return his Navy and Marine Corps medal in order to receive it. And he declined the medal. In 59, the Navy again offered it to him, and Kennedy responded, reporting the original request concerning the award. He received the same response from the Navy as he had in 1950. Give us it back, we'll give you another one. And it was just a really hard thing for him. Both of his medals, which I said I wish I had, are at his Presidential Library and Museum, which, if you ever get the chance, it's in Boston, Massachusetts. It's beautiful. I'm a member of the Victoria Society, as I've bequested in my will to donate to the JFK Library and Museum. It's very beautiful. The Victoria itself, one of his favorite sailing ships, is out there. So, and on August 12th, 1944, Joe Jr., a naval pilot, was killed in action. He was volunteering for a special and hazardous air mission when his explosive-laden plane just decided to explode over the English Channel. He's killed in action. No one knows why, how it happened. But his older brother, died, so he became the head of the family, besides his father. And on March 1st, 1945, Kennedy retired from the Naval Reserves officially on physical disability and was honorably discharged with the full rank of lieutenant. When asked later how he became a war hero, Kennedy joked, "It was really easy. Just cut my PT boat in half." So for those who, someone messaged me on Facebook over here, why he received the medals, I guess they came in a little later. This is the actual wording from the citation itself. For extremely heroic conduct of commanding officer of motor torpedo boat 109, following the collision and sinking of that vessel in the Pacific War area on August 1st through 2nd, 1943, unmindful of personal danger, Lieutenant, then Lieutenant Junior grade, excuse me, Kennedy unhysterically braved the difficulties and hazards of darkness to direct rescue operations, swimming many hours to secure aid and food after he had succeeded in getting his crew ashore. His outstanding courage, endurance, and leadership contributed to the saving of several lives and were in keeping with the highest traditions of United States naval service. That was written by James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of the Navy. Connection went out. I don't know why it keeps going out. I'm literally right next to the router. I'm going to try and fix this camera a little bit. There we go. Better camera. Better. I had to move it from the... There we go. Much better. I can look at you guys a little better. So, his post-naval service, in 1945, Kennedy's father was a friend of William Randolph Hearst. He was... Does anyone know who William Randolph Hearst was? He was a U.S. representative from New York's 11th District early on. He was an American newspaper publisher, and he had the largest news publisher chain for a long while. So he arranged a position, Kennedy's father did, Joe Sr., at Hearst newspapers to have his son as a special correspondent. The assignment kept Kennedy's name in the public eye, and, as we quote-unquote from Joe Kennedy, exposed him to journalism as a possible career. He worked as a correspondent that May, covering the Potsdam Conference and many other events throughout the end of the war. Alright, so Kate asked earlier, how did he start his political career? We're on to that part now. So, because his eldest brother had been the family's political standard bearer, so to speak, he'd been tapped by his father to seek the presidency. But his death in 1944 changed that. And now that JFK was the eldest son, it was his responsibility to become the politician in his father's eyes. Now, at the urging of Kennedy's father, U.S. Representative James Curley vacated his seat in the strongly Democratic 11th District in Massachusetts to become mayor of Boston in 1946. Because Joe Sr. said, "Kennedy, you're going to run for that seat. Come on, Jack, let's do it." So he did, and he beat his Republican opponent by a large margin in 1946. And he served as congressman for 6 years. He was very well liked by his people. Now, in 1952 Senate election, Kennedy defeated the incumbent Republican Henry Cabot Lodge II for the Senate seat. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge II was a United States ambassador later on. He was the ambassador to South Vietnam later on, and just a lot of different places. UN ambassador, he was a third UN ambassador actually. He was the senator before that, a member of the House of Representatives, and the list just goes on and on and on. His father, we know, Henry Cabot Lodge, he was the grandson. His father was George Cabot Lodge, a poet, and his grandfather was the original senator, Henry Cabot Lodge. And Henry Cabot Lodge was in the Senate in the 1900s, early 1912s, 1920s. He was a majority leader. He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Just a lot of problems there. So very famous family and Republican family. And he beat him in the Senate race. So, after he beat Lodge II in the Senate seat, the following year he had married Jacqueline Bouvier. So Kennedy underwent several spinal operations over the next 2 years as he still had problems with his back, and he was often absent from the Senate. And he was at times critically ill and received Catholic last rites several times. He thought he was going to die. During his convalescence in 1956, he published his Profile in Courage, which is a book about U.S. senators who risked their careers for their personal beliefs, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for the biography section in 1957. Rumors that this work was co-written by his close advisor and speechwriter Ted Sorensen were confirmed in Sorensen's 2008 biography. He denied it all the way up until 2008. At the 1956 Democratic National Convention, presidential nominee Addie Stevenson II let the convention select the vice president nominee. Kennedy finished second in the balloting, losing to Senator Estevez Kefauver of Tennessee, but receiving national exposure as a result. He was on the national level, almost picked for vice presidential candidate. That's usually a stepping stone for a lot of people. Vice president, then I'm going to become president. One of the matters that demanded Kennedy's attention in the Senate was President Eisenhower's bill for civil rights in 1957. Kennedy cast a procedure vote on this, which was considered by some as an appeasement of the Southern Democrats, opponents of the bill. Kennedy did vote for Title III of the Act, which would have given the Attorney General powers to enjoin, but the majority leader at the time, LBJ, or Lyndon B. Johnson, agreed to let the provision die as a compromise. Kennedy also voted for Title IV, which termed Jury Trial Amendment. Many civil rights advocates at the time criticized that the vote as of one that would weaken that act. A final compromise, which Kennedy supported, was finally passed in 1957 in September. Now, in 1958, Kennedy was re-elected to a second term in the Senate, defeating his Republican opponent, the Boston lawyer Vincent Celeste, by a margin even wider than his original Democratic vote run as just a congressman in a very Democratic state. It was during this re-election that his press secretary, Robert Thompson, as we know him, put together the film The U.S. Senator JFK Story, which exhibited a day in the life of the senator and showcased his family life as well as the inner workings of his office. It is the most comprehensive film produced of Kennedy up to that time, which it's on YouTube right now for free. While Kennedy's father was a strong supporter of Senator McCarthy, McCarthy was also a friend of the Kennedy family itself. As well, Bobby Kennedy, Robert, worked for McCarthy's subcommittee, and McCarthy dated Kennedy's sister, Patricia. So the Senate voted to censure McCarthy, however, and Kennedy drafted a speech supporting that censure. However, it was not delivered because Kennedy was hospitalized. The speech had the potential of putting Kennedy in the position of participating procedurally by preparing his vote against that of another senator. Although Kennedy was never indicated how he would have voted in that sense, the episode damaged his support among members of the liberal community, including Eleanor Roosevelt in his 1956 and 60 elections. She actually spoke out against him. We're going to get to the presidential debate here, or presidential election here, but I'm just going to double check the questions I had asked here. While I'm here, does anyone else have any other questions or comments. Kate, I could teach history. I really could. I had 4 days, remember, to prepare this, and then yesterday actually was the final vote. And whew, tell you what, Dan Nordstrom, it's a lot of work. The most memorable part about his presidency we'll get to, Kate. Alright. So, here we go. Am I back yet? Seems like I'm still frozen. Am I back? Okay, I'm back. I don't know what's up with the internet, guys. I'm on my data now. I switched over from the Wi-Fi, so it should be stronger. I have 15 gigs, so it should be strong. Alright. So on January 2nd, 1960, Kennedy initiated his campaign for president in the Democratic primary election. He was faced challengers from Senator Herbert Humphrey of Minnesota and Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon. Kennedy defeated Humphrey in Wisconsin, West Virginia, Morse in Maryland and Oregon, and the token opposition, which were a lot of write-in candidates in New Hampshire, Indiana, and Nebraska. And Kennedy visited a coal mine in West Virginia where most of the miners were predominantly conservative and Protestant states. And Kennedy was Roman Catholic and liberal. His victory in West Virginia confirmed his broad popular appeal over everybody. It's insane. He not only appealed as a younger person, but he was Catholic, and he was Democrat, where Protestant and Republican was the name of the game. That's how you won elections, especially presidential right now. At the Democratic Convention, he talked about his new frontier. Very famous quote from his New Frontier speech was, "For the problems are not all solved and battles are not all won, and we stand today at the edge of a new frontier. But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them for me." So Kennedy's main opponent, after he had eliminated Humphrey and after he had eliminated Morse, was at the Los Angeles Convention, was Senator LBJ of Texas. Kennedy overcame this challenge, and he decided, hey, I need your strength in the South to win this election. So he chose Johnson to be his vice presidential running mate. His biggest problems were to try and get the economy moving again, his Roman Catholicism, Cuba, and whether the Soviet space and missile programs had surpassed those of the U.S. So, to address his fears of being Catholic and what people talked about him, he said, "I am not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party candidate for president who happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." He questioned rhetorically whether 1/4 of Americans were regulated to second-class citizenship just because they were Catholic, and he had once stated that no one asked me my religion serving in the Navy while I was in the South Pacific. So, Kennedy appeared with the vice presidential and Republican candidate Richard Nixon in the first televised U.S. presidential debates in U.S. history. During these programs, Nixon, with a sore, injured leg and his 5 o'clock shadow, was perspiring and looked tense and really uncomfortable and really, really old, while Kennedy, choosing to avail himself for makeup services, appeared relaxed, leading the huge television audience to favor him as the winner, whether or not he actually won the debates. Radio listeners either thought that Nixon had won or that the debates were a draw. So, looking at Kennedy in his youth actually helped him in the elections. When you had the TV and you were looking at him, he looks really young, looks great. We're going to vote for him. You only hear him, you think Nixon won. So, Kennedy's campaign gained momentum after that first debate, and he pulled slightly ahead of Nixon. Now, on November 8th, Kennedy defeated Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections of the 20th century. In the national popular vote, Kennedy led Nixon by just 0.2%. He won 49.7% of the popular vote, and Nixon won 49.5%. While the Electoral College, because he won the big states, he won 303 votes to 219 of Nixon's. 269 at the time were required to win. Now, 14 electors from Mississippi and Alabama refused to support Kennedy because he supported the Civil Rights Movement, and they voted for Harry F. Byrd of Virginia, as did one elector from Oklahoma. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president, and he succeeded Eisenhower, who was then the oldest elected. Now, later on, Ronald Reagan in 1981 became the eldest elected. Now, notice I said elected. Teddy Roosevelt succeeded the presidency after an assassination and was the youngest serving president. So there's a difference between elected and serving. Any questions on any of that, guys, before I move on to his presidency itself? I'm going to get into some of the big topics, some of the problems with the USSR, Cuba, and just different things. For those just joining me, this will be on YouTube later on. As well, I'm going to comment at the end and then post on Facebook the link to it, and then I created a website if you want to get involved in these talks. I'm not going to be the only one talking every week. I'm going to have some friends on here next week. I'm hoping to have a good friend of mine, Sepp Panzer, to be talking about some moral and ethical issues and topics. Wonderful man to choose that one. So if you guys want to get involved, please join me. I'm also going to be talking about, I've already chosen a couple weeks out, one of the topics that will have heart to me. Kate, you'll want to watch that one. I'm going to be talking about Aikido. So, John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th president. Okay. Thank you, Dan Nordstrom. In the United States, the question is, why was his religion something he had to overcome? In the United States, we had a kind of a history of electing Protestant white older males to the presidency. And it was just something that only less than a quarter of the country's population were Catholic at the time. Now it's a little more. And people, because Protestantism and Catholicism have so many problems, even though it's all Christianity, it's all part of Christendom, people didn't really like it. They thought Protestant white male, but he obviously overcame this when he became president. So JFK was sworn in as the 35th president at noon on January 20th, 1961. In his inaugural address, he spoke of the need for all Americans to be active citizens, famously saying, as I stated before, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He asked nations of the world to join together in what he called to fight the common enemies of men, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. He also added on, I'm going to directly quote from this, that all this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. He set the pathway. He paved that road. He expanded his desire for internationalism because the U.S. had been isolated again. He said, finally, whether you're citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. He kind of glazed his presidency. He said, we're going to do this. He laid his framework. All right. So Kennedy's first action as president did not come like a lot of presidents a week or 2 weeks after he was inaugurated. It came the next day. He issued Executive Order 10914, which directed the doubling of the quantity of surplus food distributed to needy families. He also attended a meeting of the Democratic National Committee, and he attended the swearing-in, of his cabinet. On January 22nd, 2 days, he met with the poet Robert Frost. And then President Kennedy, his brother Ted, and Paul B. Frey attended Mass at the Holy Trinity Catholic Church. And Kennedy also established a 3-member government ethics committee. It was interesting to have this government ethics committee put up only 2 days after being president. What was he doing that we needed to see? What was he preparing to do that ethics were going to be involved? Later on the 1st of February, he held his second presidential news conference. He announced the establishment of 5 pilot food stamp distribution projects. And he later met with his economic and budget advisors. And Kennedy holds his first meeting of National Security Council and sends a letter to Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, marking the scheduled launch of the USS Sam Houston, which was a boomer-class SSBN 609 submarine, which was the next day. Just quick side note, the boomer class, proud to say my grandfather served on the USS Lafayette SSBN 616, 61 to 63. So, later on, in March, Kennedy emphasized the theme of public service in his inaugural address. He issued his Executive Order 10924, which established the Peace Corps, which is known as a temporary pilot basis. Well, Peace Corps exist today. He also made a tape with Eleanor Roosevelt, recording and promoting the Youth Peace Corps, and Kennedy recorded a message for the American Red Cross. Then he signed a joint law resolution, HJ Resolution 155, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the first inauguration of Abraham Lincoln on March 4th, 61. Now, we had a lot of problems in his presidency. And like I said, it's going to be a quick overview of all of it, and I'm only going to pick on the important pieces. How do I say this? In a joint session to Congress in May of 61, Kennedy announced full presidential support for the goal to commit before this decade is out to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. And he urged Congress to appropriate the necessary funds for this. I will get to Camelot. That's a good thing to bring up. Now, before I move on to 1962, are there any questions or anything? I'm going to play something for you. So you can hear it. So this is from Congress. It's a live recording.
These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. Our strength as well as our convictions have imposed upon this nation the role of leader in freedom's cause. Now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary But the facts of the matter are that we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space...
Now that's just a short bit, about 2.5 minutes of his full speech, which is very, very long and outlines all his goals of spaceflight. Now, with the space race as we call it, it became something that he truly and adamantly believed in. He just decided that we're going to do this. We're not going to let the Russians beat us. We're going to do it, and we're going to make it happen. Now, to finish up 1961, Kennedy made a series of trips, but in June, he visited with Queen Elizabeth II and the Prime Minister Macmillan in London. And he kind of outlined, like I said, we're going to land on the moon on May 21st, land on the moon, return safely to Earth. And he explained this to the British Queen, and she thought he was insane. And he said, I'm not insane, I'm going to do this. My country will do this. Not because we want to, but because we choose to. On January 11th, 1962, he delivered his second State of the Union address. And then as Commander-in-Chief, Kennedy, in February, commuted the military death sentence of Jimmy Henderson, which is a famous case, to life imprisonment, marking the last time in the 20th century that an American president was faced with such a decision. So it was last time for a long time. Kennedy signed into law the H.R. 5143, which was the mandatory death penalty for first-degree murder in the District of Columbia, which was the only jurisdiction in the U.S. which had the mandatory death sentence for first-degree murder. Now it's life in prison, and a jury can decide between death penalty. In May of '62, he signed the Educational Televised Facilities Act, making the first time Congress provided major federal aid to public broadcasting. Now, as part of his 45th birthday activities, Marilyn Monroe had sung Happy Birthday, Mr. President in the Madison Square Gardens as part of his birthday celebrations, which is where we get a lot of these Marilyn Monroe and JFK affair stories. Besides this event, there's only one other known event that they were together at Camp David, but his wife was there. So the conspiracy of him dating and having an affair with Marilyn Monroe, who knows? He took that one to his grave. What was I going to say? At Rice University in September, he gave a speech on the subject of the nation's plan to land those humans on the moon again. Kennedy announced his continued support for the increased space expenditures. And like I said, he had said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard, and we are Americans. Now, on October 22nd, in a televised address, Kennedy announces that the October 14th discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, making public the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he also announced the naval quarantine of all of his military equipment on that country. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which we're going to talk about here for a moment. There's a famous movie called 13 Days. It's really, really good. Very, very accurate. It was a missile scare for over 13 days from October 16th to October 28th, 1962, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union concerning the Soviet ballistic missile development in Cuba. It was the closest the Cold War ever came to being a full-scale war. Full-scale nuclear war. In response to the 1961 failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Secretary General or President leader of the USSR, agreed to plant nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter their harassment. It became so contentious that we were on the brink of war where no one knew if tomorrow, today, 10 seconds from now, we weren't going to be here. We see those things in the 50s, the old videos about the problems, but now it became more real life for these kids as they had just thought about it, and now that it was public. Luckily, after the naval blockade ended November 20th, quote-unquote, 1962, which actually didn't. We still had the embargo until this year. The result of the back-channeled, as I mentioned earlier, negotiations between Bobby Kennedy and the Soviets, a withdrawal of all Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuba, a withdrawal of American nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy, an agreement with the Soviet Union that the United States would never invade Cuba without direct provocation, and that the creation of nuclear hotline between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the Red Line phone, which we still have to this day, to the Kremlin, straight from the White House. All right. So, where was I? So, Kennedy became a laureate. He got the Literary Medal by Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, the president of the University of Notre Dame. The medal was annually awarded by Notre Dame, is considered the highest award for American Catholics itself. Kennedy was presented with the award in the Oval Office and was also a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. The Reverend Edmund P. Joyce, the university's executive vice president, was there as well. So now we move on to the last year of Kennedy's presidency, 1963. In 1963, Kennedy announced his appointment of David L. Lawrence as chairman of the President's Committee on Equal Opportunity in Housing. And he delivered his third, on the 14th of January, 2 days later, his third and what would later become his final State of the Union address. Now, how do I say this? Because this was his last year, and obviously he didn't know it was, he tried to push for a lot of things. He traveled a lot out of the country. A lot. On June 26th, President Kennedy delivered his now famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech in West Berlin. All free men are Berliners. I am a Berliner. You know. Later on, this was dialogued by Ronald Reagan in his Ich hab noch einen Koffer ein Berlin speech and Tear Down This Wall, Mr. Gorbachev. So it became a very interesting step. Now, Kennedy, on June 11th, before this, delivers a televised address on the civil rights as to his orders regarding the stand in the schoolhouse door and further calls for legislation to enact the Civil Rights Bill. Now, Kennedy later on has said June 26th he visited West Berlin and gave his Ich bin ein Berliner speech, and he advocated representative democracy and capitalism as a replacement for the communist regimes around the world. Not just there, but around the world. Later on, he went to Dublin, then to more in the UK, to Naples, to Rome. He had an audience with the newly elected Pope Paul VI at the Apostolic, I can never say it, Apostolic Palace in the Vatican City. He then met with the Boys Nation senators, including future President Bill Clinton, and then Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, Miss the President and Miss Kennedy's third child, was born 5 weeks prematurely. Shortly after his birth, the child ended up developing syndromes of haline membrane disease, which is now infant respiratory disease syndrome. And 2 days later, he died at the Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Martin Luther King, later on October 28th, met with President Kennedy alongside other civil rights activists. Now we get to his last month in office. He addressed the UN. It was his second address to the General Assembly, that they needed to move the world to a just and lasting peace. And this was actually echoed by Nikita Khrushchev. For the first time, a Soviet leader agreed with an American. On November 18th, Kennedy traveled to Tampa, Florida, where he visited the Military Strike Command headquarters, attended a luncheon, and made a speech at the Chamber of Commerce, and then another to the Steelworkers Union. Then on November 21st, he asked his economic advisors to prepare a war on poverty in 1964. And on November 22nd, President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally were shot at 12:30 Central Standard Time in Daley Plaza, Dallas, Texas. They are both rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where Kennedy is pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with murder, and then Oswald is shot and killed 2 days later by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby. At the same time, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One. And on the 23rd, Kennedy lied in repose at the White House East Room for a period of 24 hours. At 4:45 p.m., President Johnson issued the Proclamation 3561, declaring the 25th of November, the day of the funeral service, to be National Day of Mourning. On November 24th, Kennedy lied in state for a period of 18 hours. NBC broadcast live, uninterrupted coverage of people passing through the Capitol Rotunda during the overnight hours to see President Kennedy. And then on November 25th, Kennedy's funeral service was held. Representatives from well over 90 countries were in attendance. Now, as I said, I'm a newspaper collector and different things. I had someone bring me this recently, where I have a lot of the different and original newspapers at the time of his assassination. The swearing in of Johnson. One of the most famous pictures, and the one I want to show. Someone said there was no clear picture ever of of Jack Ruby shooting Oswald. Right before Oswald was shot, this famous picture was taken of Jack Ruby in the corner with the hat, pulling out his gun. So Jack Ruby and his gun, as Oswald is being escorted right before he's shot. Now, President Kennedy is laid to rest now at Arlington National Cemetery, where he still is today. I've seen it. Upon request of the now former First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, an eternal flame, which was inspired by the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, later known as the John F. Kennedy Eternal Flame, is set up by the Corps of Engineers and was lit by Mrs. Kennedy. It still goes all day, every day in Arlington, that eternal flame. And it's a interesting thing when you're there. It's something to see. I can't really describe the feelings I had. Now, I promised some conspiracy theories, but before I do, does anyone have any questions? So why did Russia and the U.S. need to learn how to speak differently to each other? Well, we had different modes. We were capitalist and we were what we call free. The Soviet Union was communist, or technically they were socialist, because communism never has actually happened in the world because it's so free. But it was, we were totally different political spectrums. We had freedoms. USSR didn't. So, some of the conspiracy theories about JFK, as I promised, I'd go over some of them. So, I'm going to talk about the coincidences between him and President Lincoln. Both became members of the House of Representatives in 46. Both were losing candidates for the party's vice presidential nomination in 56. Both were elected to the presidency in 60. Lincoln defeated incumbent Vice President John C. Breckinridge for president in 1860, and Kennedy defeated incumbent Vice President Nixon in 1960. Both predecessors were the last presidents to be born in their respective centuries. Both presidents left office in the both their predecessors left their offices and retired to Pennsylvania. Both vice presidents and successors were Southern Democrats named Johnson, Andrew Johnson, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who were both born in 1808 and 1908, respectively. Both were concerned with problems of black Americans and made their way strongly in 63. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 62, and in 63 he presented to Congress his reports on civil rights. Both presidents and their successors conferred with nationally known black leaders' civil rights. Frederick Douglass for Lincoln and Dr. King for Kennedy. Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald in a Lincoln automobile made by Ford. Lincoln was shot at a theater and he ran to a warehouse by Booth. Kennedy was shot by Oswald, who was in a warehouse and ran to a theater. Both assassins' full names have 15 letters, and both presidents' last names have 7 letters. Each assassin committed his crime in the building where he was employed. Both presidents were purportedly smiling immediately before their assassination began, and after both assassins died in the same month as their victim in a state adjacent to the state of their births. So there's a lot of similarities. Lincoln sat in box number 7 at Ford's Theater. Kennedy sat in car number 7 in a Ford in the motorcade. So a lot of similarities for that. How do I say this? It's really interesting to go off of all these conspiracy theories. One of the famous ones you can look at is on theweek.co.uk. They kind of just talked about the different theories. So the magic bullet theory was Oswald fired just 3 bullets in Dallas, but he killed JFK and badly wounded Governor Connally, who was sitting in the front seat of the limousine. The Warren Commission, which was the investigation into JFK's killing, came up with the single bullet theory to explain how Oswald did so much with just 3 rounds. It posed that both men were hit by a single bullet, which entered JFK's upper back, exited through his throat, and struck Connally, breaking a rib and shattering his wrist, finally coming to rest in that thigh. Dan Nordstrom, I do have to say that's not a proven fact that they had secretaries like that. The known secretaries actually had different names. But yeah, I've heard that one. Skeptics say the trajectory was fantastical and renamed it the magic bullet theory because it would have had to curve. The grassy knoll, most JFK conspiracy theorists pivot around the idea that Oswald wasn't acting alone And when the president was hit by the bullet that killed him, the motorcade was passing a grassy knoll on the north side of Elm Street. Newspaper photographs record that shortly after the shooting, police arrested 3 tramps found in the railroad car behind the knoll. Because the men were clean-shaven and well-dressed, it was speculation that they were CIA assassins rather than just normal hobos. Now, here we go. This one's interesting. Earlier in this election season that we have nowadays, presidential nominee Donald Trump insinuated that Senator Ted Cruz's father was connected to the assassination. It was interesting. He said, "Now let's be clear, this is nuts. This is not a reasonable position. This is kooky," said Senator Cruz. And I guess I should go ahead and admit, yes, my dad killed JFK. He's secretly Elvis, and Jimmy Hoffa is buried in our backyard. I mean, the lists go on and on about all the different conspiracy theories that surround JFK. And one that's really interesting is that there's the Illuminati one. Dad Nordstrom, I know you feel the same way I do about this, but the secretive power brokers who control the world, known as the Illuminati, says that he fell foul of the Illuminati, and it's been suggested because he wanted to end the Vietnam War, and that the Illuminati were angered by his attempts to rein in the power of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and that they decided, you know what, we're just going to shoot him. I don't get that. And there's plethora of these conspiracy theories. Now, before I finish up tonight, because like I said, this is a great overview of JFK. It's going to be online again on our account. We're going to, on our YouTube account, I want to invite everybody and anybody to make comments, questions, concerns, anything you have right now. Just because it's the end, I want to know what you're going for before I give my final remarks for the night. No one? Alright, so, as we spoke about JFK tonight, I want people to remember one thing. If you remember one thing in anything in life, it is that President Kennedy was someone ahead of his time. He decided to move us forward in a time when moving forward was not a good option. He said, I'm going to do this not because I want to, but because we need to, and because my people need me to. He was someone who, he gave his all in his life to the United States. A military officer, a member of Congress, and eventually president. And he kind of inspires a lot of people even unto this day, and a lot of questions, remarks, movies. And it's just something that it's really interesting. I want you just to remember that he's a normal person before he became president. Now, a question was, how did the Kennedys make their money? Well, they were drug dealers of their time. The drug dealers of the time was bootlegging. 1920s illegal. During the Prohibition, bootlegging was alcohol selling and making. Aubrey, it's going to be on YouTube. I'll post the link and send you a message in a minute. My favorite president, as it's been asked, is, believe it or not, I've always been taken, I have 2. George Washington and Franklin Roosevelt. There are many, many, many reasons I could go over these, but it's hard for me to send these out, but I love George Washington because no one can ever do what he did. He's the first president. He decided to do things on his own, made it up along the way. He set so many precedents, the 2-term precedent. And then I love Franklin Roosevelt for the fact that he's Franklin Roosevelt. The only man to challenge besides Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin. He was the only one to challenge and be elected 4 times to the presidency. 4 times. Where's my love for Monroe? Well, you know, James Monroe was an interesting president. He was, I call him a sitting president. He didn't do much. He was the 5th president. I mean, he was Secretary of State and Secretary of War under Madison during the 12 Years' War, but he's the one who, how do I say this? His biggest accomplishment, I mean, is buying Florida. But I mean, do we really want Florida nowadays? I thought Florida was its own, like, country, you know, not even part of us. But yes, so that'll do it for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to post this video on YouTube, share the link on my page, as well as a link to a new website. We're going to call this series the Discussion Central. Discussion Central is going to be kind of a group where you guys can come in. I want everyone to speak and comment. Dad Nordstrom's been a wonderful mediator. I want to thank you for this tonight. Not a lot of questions tonight. I think not a lot of people had some, but the ones we had were great. Everyone else, I hope you have a wonderful night and wonderful time. Alright, Zach, I'll say hola to you. Now, tú necesitas hablar español.